Welcome back. Right now we have award-winning director Nick Quested here to tell us all about his new documentary called Hell of a Cruise. So excited to have Nick here with us today. Tell us about this documentary.
This documentary is about the first super spreader event. That's about the passengers' experiences on the Diamond Princess, which is the first super spreader event outside of China. But then it expands the story into how the executive branch and the cruise industry responded to COVID outbreaks on a variety of ships that kept sailing.
Now, Nick, we all remember news about the cruise ship, but when you think back at that time and when you heard the news reports about this cruise ship and COVID-19, what sticks out in your mind? What do you remember from that moment?
Well, I think we're all in the same sense of like having a fear of the unknown. Remember, this was we've got to take ourselves back to the psyche of America in spring and summer of 2020. You've got COVID in full swing. You have the murder of George Floyd and the protests that are rapidly becoming, in some cities, medieval style pitched battles between police and protesters. And the rhetoric in the country is becoming more polarized and more inflammatory. And we're in the run up to a general election, so there was a lot of trepidation and fear at that point for everyone, I felt.
What made you decide to create a documentary about the Diamond Princess cruise ship and the events surrounding that time?
Well, we thought it was important because we look for small events that explain bigger events. So the Diamond Princess is a small event, but it's the first super spreader event. And as the doctors on the boat said, we knew everything we needed to know about COVID-19 after they got off the Diamond Princess and had repatriated the passengers. So I think it's important to look at that because it wasn't just the Diamond Princess. It was the Costa Luminosa, it was the Grand Princess, it was the Ruby Princess. And again, we were seeing the same effects after someone had COVID on the boat. So we wanted to examine why, what happens and show it to people, because as our statistics, as we discovered, on March 25th, 17% of all COVID infections in America were linked to cruise ships.
When you interviewed the passengers that were on that cruise ship, what surprised you about the things that they told you?
Well, the actual interviews with the passengers were fascinating because we had to tread this line because they'd all had, many of them had traumatic experiences on the cruises. So to go and ask people to talk about this again is a delicate situation where you want them to tell the story and you want it to be emotional, but you don't want them to be traumatized again by telling the story. So we tried to make this a cathartic experience rather than a traumatic experience.
What was the most fascinating thing that you learned about that cruise ship while producing this documentary?
One of the most fascinating things was from one of the doctors, Dr. Callahan. He went to Liberia in 2012. Every time there's an infectious disease outbreak, they send Dr. Callahan. He's the real Dustin Hoffman of Outbreak. He's the real Kate Winslet from Contagion. Like, he's that person. So he went to Liberia and he interdicted a plane that was headed back to America during the height of the Ebola crisis. They tested all the passengers on the plane and 30 people had tested positive for Ebola. He stopped a plane headed for America with 30 people on it who had Ebola. That's how close we've been to cataclysmic infectious disease outbreak in America before. We live, because of globalization, on the razor's edge.
It's scary to think about how close we are to this type of situation, which I know that this was part of that documentary, and it's something we all think about.
The pandemic was a naturally occurring virus that was propagated naturally through, the extensive lines of communication in the world. Imagine you have a bad actor in the mix with an infectious disease that deliberately wants to infect Americans.
What is it that you hope people will take away after seeing this documentary?
I wanted people to take away that we knew, as the doctor said, they knew what they needed to know. So if we are to face this again, I think we need to come together as a country and not use issues to divide ourselves politically, but think about public health policy as something that should unite us in the face of an unseen enemy. And I'd also like to have some scrutiny into the legislation that cruise ships operate under, and potentially have a Bill of Rights for passengers and for the crew on there as well. Like, because at the moment, when you get on a cruise ship, you're stepping out of America and into the unknown. You're not in America anymore, and the laws of America don't apply to you. So if you hurt yourself, there are very few redresses to that.
Nick, knowing what you know now, do you think the worst of COVID-19 is over?
I think the worst of COVID-19 is behind us. We have therapeutics now that are effective. We have algorithms that, that are, but it also depends on perspective. The worst of COVID-19 is probably over for North America, but for the rest of the world, you're still seeing people die at a horrific rate. So, but as far as America goes, I think the worst of the pandemic is behind us.
Hell of a Cruise is a documentary that is now available to stream on Peacock. Thank you so much, Nick Quested, for joining us today. Really appreciate your time and telling us all about this intriguing documentary. We'll be back with more right after this.